Well, welcome back to another episode of 42nd Street Pete's Grindhouse. And I got in a Lee Marvin frame of mind the other night, so I pulled out a couple classics, shall we say. And one of them is the first from 1973, directed by Robert Aldrich. The original title was Emperor of the North Pole, but the studio knocked off the pole because they didn't want the public to think it was a Christmas movie, which it definitely wasn't. Emperor of the North Pole is a hobo term because this is shot during the Depression, when basically hobos were that era's homeless. Guys that were looking for work, that were living outside, that read the rails and were scrounging for food and whatever. And the whole premise of this thing is it stars Lee Marvin as hobo A number one, Ernest Borgnine is Shaq, this tradesman who basically hates hobos and basically brags that none of them will ever ride his train without getting knocked off or killed. And Keith Carradine is Cigarette, who's an up-and-coming hobo. And, of course, a lot of character actors you'll see, like Vic Tayback, Matt Clark, Elijah Cook Jr., Sid Haig, and Charles Tyner, and some other people you'd recognize in there. And basically, the premise is that A number one wants to ride the train till the end and will basically try to take on Shaq to do it. There's been a couple other escapades which Shaq were basically, one hobo got on the train and Shaq hit him in the head with a fucking small sledgehammer. The guy fell on the tracks and was cut in half. That's the breaks with Shaq. Shaq basically is being played to the hilt sadistically by Ernest Borgnine, who's one of the greatest character actors of all times. Another thing that Shaq does to get rid of the bums is basically they can get into the undercarriage of the train and like hang on, they somehow wedge themselves into the framework of the train. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen a window sash wait. But it was in the old houses. I don't even know if they still make them, but they were about like yo long and maybe that thick, and they had an eye hook on the top where the sash used to kick in. Well, what Shaq does is he gets a length of rope and ties it around this thing and figures out which car the bums are hiding under and lowers the rope down and lets it snake under the train. As the train bumps along, this thing shoots up after it hits, the railroad ties and stuff, and basically beats the shit out of the bums and dislodges them and makes them get run over by the train. Cool, right? Well, anyway, that happens like twice, and Cigarette seems to be like A number one's nemesis because he wants to be the Emperor of the North, and he's not. And after a couple trials and tribulations, there is a huge fight in an open car on the train between Shaq and A number one, involving chains, 2x4s, and axe, and all kinds of other shit. According to what I read, this fight scene took 35 days to film. Ernest Borgnine said it's the most physically demanding scene he'd ever shot. It winds up with Shaq being tossed out of his train and screaming revenge. And with A number one screaming at Cigarette, who he throws out of the train, that you're never going to be where I am, basically this, that, and the other thing. Don't know if this thing actually ever went over as a hit. It's kind of an oddball type of thing, but it's actually a really good character study of the three, men in question, Shaq, A number one, and Cigarette. So it's available on, pretty much available on Blu-ray, I would think, at this stage of the game. But another Lee Marvin movie that I had to pull out was The Great Scout and Cathouse Thursday, starring Lee Marvin, Oliver Reed, and Robert Culp. Now, the backstory is that Lee Marvin is the Great Scout. Oliver Reed is Indian Joe Knox in a type of miscasting that basically is so politically incorrect at this point it ain't funny, but hey, I'm sure that the PC cancel culture fucking people would find a lot to disagree with this film, because for a PG-rated film it has ample nudity and prostitution, and the word rape is thrown about a few times, because the Cathouse Thursday is played by Kay Lenz, who thinks she's going to get raped by Joe Knox, who basically, what Joe Knox does is, he wants to get even with the white man, so he has syphilis and decides to kidnap a paddy wagon full of whores and basically, infect them all and then send them on their way to infect the white man, then capture another bunch and send them on his way. Yeah, it's very politically correct here. But anyway, an old buddy of theirs, Jack Colby, who sort of burned them on a gold mine deal and was into politics and promoting a huge prize fight, is in town, and they decide to confront him about money owed to them. Well, he only wants to pay them $4,000 where they want like $60,000. So they go back and forth and back and forth. And Strother Martin is part of the gang, Billy, who basically wants to turn Thursday back into her, owner or madam, because he'll get $50 or 5 free visits to the whorehouse. Like I said, completely politically incorrect. Sylvia Miles is playing Mike, the madam. Elizabeth Ashley is playing Jack Colby's wife, who basically Joe Knox and the scout kidnap, and it winds up that Colby doesn't want her back. Well, it gets even more politically incorrect because she decides that she wants revenge too. So there's a big fight at the end between the great scout and Jack Colby, which ends in a big muddy mess, and I don't think anything's ever resolved to this thing. The film plays it for comedy. Like I said, it's politically incorrect, it's kind of a mess, but all these guys had worked with each other previously. Robert Culp and Strother Martin, 5 years prior to this film, were in Haney Calder with Raquel Welch as Borgnine. Lee Marvin had worked with Strother Martin a number of times, including Attack, the war movie in 1956. In Liberty Valance in 1962, where he was part of Lee Marvin's gang, or he was Lee Marvin's gang along with Lee Van Cleef, and Pocket Money in 1972, and also the Twilight episode of The Grave, which basically reunited, actually it didn't reunite the gang because the gang hadn't been formed in 1961. Liberty Valance was 1962, so standing over the grave, which Lee Marvin was in the grave, was Strother Martin, Lee Van Cleef, and James Best. So, interesting how all these guys, interspersed with their career. Also, when you involve Oliver Reed and Lee Marvin, there was supposedly a lot of heavy drinking during the production, and there was a drinking contest between Lee Marvin and Oliver Reed that went up until 10 hours when Lee Marvin passed out. So, honestly, if I ever wanted to get drunk with a bunch of character actors, let's pick 5 actors and me. It would be Lee Marvin, Oliver Reed, Robert Mitchum, Richard Boone, and I'd say Lee Van Cleef. So if I was going to get drunk with 5 character actors, those were the guys I'd want to get drunk with. So these are 2 really good films, and I believe that Lee Marvin sort of semi-retired from acting after The Great Scout. I think his health was in decline too because of his drinking, but love Lee Marvin. Huge Lee Marvin fan. I believe there's an organization called the Bastard Sons of Lee Marvin, which I actually should join. I should look that up. So that's our episode for today. Lee Marvin's been in a ton of other stuff too. I mean, he started out as a heavy, and you can see him in an early shot with Ernest Borgnine in Bad Day at Black Rock, where they were tormenting Spencer Tracy, and Robert Ryan's also in that one too. So until our next episode, stay safe, thanks for subscribing, and we'll catch you on the flip side.